Imagine a nation so deeply divided that brother fights brother, neighbor turns against neighbor, and a country built on the idea of unity tears itself apart. This is the story of the American Civil War, a conflict that reshaped the United States forever. It's a story of power, politics, freedom, and human cost on a massive scale. But this wasn't a war that began overnight. It was the result of decades of tension, compromise, and growing distrust. To understand how it all happened, we need to go back long before the first shot was fired. In the early 1800s, the United States was expanding westward at a rapid pace. New lands were being added, and with each new territory came a critical and unavoidable question. Would it allow slavery or not? At first, leaders tried to maintain a balance between free states and slave states. Agreements like the Missouri Compromise attempted to draw a line across the country, literally dividing where slavery could exist. Later, the Compromise of 1850 tried again to ease tensions. But these were temporary solutions to a permanent problem. Because the North and South were becoming fundamentally different societies, the North was industrializing quickly. Cities were growing, factories were producing goods, railroads were connecting regions, immigration was increasing the population and fueling economic expansion. The South, on the other hand, remained largely agricultural. Its economy depended heavily on crops like cotton and tobacco, and those crops depended on enslaved labor. But this divide wasn't just economic, it was deeply ideological. Many in the South believed strongly in states' rights. The idea that individual states should have the power to govern themselves without interference from the federal government. Many in the North, especially as abolitionist movements grew stronger, believed that slavery was morally wrong and should not expand into new territories. As both sides became more entrenched in their beliefs, compromise became harder, then things turned violent. In a period known as Bleeding Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in brutal conflict, essentially turning the territory into a preview of the coming war. At the same time, abolitionists became more vocal and more organized. Figures like Frederick Douglass spoke out powerfully against slavery, while Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin exposed its harsh realities to a wide audience. Tensions rose even further after events like John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, an attempt to start a slave uprising that shocked the nation. By the time the 1860 presidential election arrived, the country was already on edge. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, everything changed. Lincoln did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery everywhere, but he firmly opposed its expansion into new territories. To many in the South, that was enough. They feared that their entire way of life, their economy, their social structure, their political power was under threat. And so, one by one, Southern states began to secede from the Union. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president and began organizing their own government and military. The United States was no longer united, but the conflict was still, at this point, political. That changed in April of 1861. At Fort Sumter, a Union-held fort in South Carolina, Confederate forces opened fire. After 34 hours of bombardment, Union forces surrendered. The Civil War had officially begun. At first, many people on both sides believed the war would be short. There was a sense of optimism, even excitement. Some thought it would be over in a matter of months. But reality set in quickly. The First Battle of Bull Run proved that this would not be a quick or easy fight. It was chaotic, disorganized, and far more brutal than expected. As the war expanded, both sides began to mobilize on a massive scale. The Union had significant advantages. It had a larger population, more industry, more railroads, and more resources overall. It also had a functioning government and established infrastructure. The Confederacy, however, had its own strengths. Its leaders included highly skilled military commanders like Robert E. Lee. Its soldiers were often deeply motivated, fighting to defend their homes and way of life, and much of the war would take place on Southern soil, giving them a geographic advantage. What followed was a long and grueling conflict. Battles stretched across vast distances, from the Eastern Theater in Virginia to the Western Theater along the Mississippi River. New technologies made the war more deadly than ever before. Rifled muskets, ironclad ships, and railroads changed how war was fought. But tactics hadn't fully adapted. Soldiers still fought in traditional formations, leading to devastating casualties. Entire regiments could be wiped out in minutes. The human cost was staggering. As the war dragged on into its third year, both sides were exhausted. But 1863 would prove to be a turning point. In July of that year, two major events shifted the momentum of the war. The first was the Battle of Gettysburg, For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces clashed in one of the most intense battles ever fought on American soil. When it was over, tens of thousands were dead, wounded, or missing. But the Union had held its ground. General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North had been stopped. From that point on, the Confederacy would largely be on the defensive. At nearly the same time, in the Western Theater, Union forces achieved another major victory at Vicksburg. After a long siege, the city fell, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River. This effectively split the Confederacy in two, making it much harder for them to coordinate and supply their forces. But 1863 was significant for another reason as well. It marked a shift in the purpose of the war. With the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. While it didn't immediately free all enslaved people, it changed the nature of the conflict. The war was now not just about preserving the Union, it was also about ending slavery. This had a powerful impact. It discouraged European nations from supporting the Confederacy, and it allowed African American soldiers to join the Union Army, adding strength to its forces. As the war continued, it became increasingly harsh. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman adopted a strategy of total war. During his march to the sea, his troops moved through the South, destroying railroads, infrastructure, crops, and supplies. The goal was to break not just the Confederate Army, but its ability and will to continue fighting. Meanwhile, General Ulysses S. Grant engaged Confederate forces in a series of relentless battles. Rather than retreating after losses, Grant continued to press forward, knowing that the Union could better sustain the cost of war. This constant pressure wore down the Confederacy. Its economy collapsed, supplies ran low, morale declined. By 1865, the end was near. In April, Confederate General Robert E. Lee met Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. There, Lee surrendered his army. After 4 years of brutal conflict, the Civil War was over. The cost was immense. More than 600,000 soldiers had died, more than any other war in American history. Cities were destroyed, families were shattered, the nation was deeply scarred, but the Union had been preserved, and slavery as an institution was coming to an end. Yet even in victory, tragedy struck. Just days after the war ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The country had lost its leader at the very moment it needed unity the most. What followed was a difficult and complicated period known as Reconstruction. The goal was to rebuild the South, reintegrate the former Confederate states, and define the rights of newly freed African Americans. Several constitutional amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. The 15th Amendment aimed to protect voting rights regardless of race. These were major steps forward. But Reconstruction was far from smooth. There was resistance in the South. New systems of racial discrimination emerged. Progress was often met with backlash. The legacy of the Civil War did not end in 1865. It continued to shape American society, politics, and identity for generations. And in many ways, it still does. The American Civil War was more than a battle between North and South. It was a struggle over the very meaning of freedom, equality, and unity. It forced a nation to confront its deepest contradictions. And while it brought immense suffering, it also led to profound change. Understanding this history helps us understand not just the past, but the world we live in today, because history is never truly over. It lives on in the choices we make, the values we defend, and the stories we continue to tell.